join us, and we'll be getting started at about 5:35. So thank you for being on time. Leilani is here. Okay.
I am here, and I apologize for being late.
Okay.
I'm just going to adjust my lights because I see that I look like I'm trying to make, I don't know what that looks like, but it doesn't look good.
All right.
So Ron, are we good to go?
We're good to go.
Okay.
People are still coming, but might as well get started.
Okay. Leilani, I actually liked your lights like that, but but this is great too. Welcome everybody to the spring lecture series. This is just a brief message from your sponsor before we get to the interesting parts of the evening. My name is Eve Barron. I'm the chair of the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment at Pratt Institute. And the GCPE, as we call it, is an interdisciplinary department made up of 4 programs, graduate programs, and historic preservation, urban placemaking and management, sustainable environmental systems, and city and regional planning. Our roots are in community development. We're practice oriented. We teach participatory process as the best way to support and advocate for just sustainable neighborhoods and communities. So our spring lecture series represents the type of interdisciplinary collaborative dialogue that's essential for this kind of educational approach. Each spring, we bring together cross sections of people across fields that include community organizing, policymaking, technical experts, decision makers, labor leaders, and advocates who unpack the issues of the day and bring forward just solutions. It's great to see so many people here tonight. Thank you for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, including some of our recently accepted students who were accepted for the fall to our program. So congratulations on that, and thank you for coming. Tonight's panel is the third in the series, An Equitable Recovery Agenda for New York. And we're pleased to once again partner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance to curate and moderate the panels. I also wanted to thank Ameren Lee, Delane Morris, and Meredith Tenhoor for their support. So our panelists tonight and our discussion is going to be moderated by Ron Schiffman and Eddie Bautista. Ron has been with Pratt Institute for quite a long time, and we're very proud that now he holds the title of Professor Emeritus at GCPE. And Eddie Bautista is the Executive Director of NEJA, which is a citywide network of community-based organizations of color advocating for the empowerment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. Eddie is also an alumni of the City and Regional Planning Program, and we're very proud to claim him. So Eddie, I'm going to hand it over to you to get the ball rolling.
Sure. Good evening, folks, and thanks so much for joining us. I won't keep us too long from jumping into what's going to be an exciting session. I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime, Ron Schiffman, who will be taking on moderating duties for tonight. You know, if there are possibly people in this audience that don't know who Ron is, you better ask somebody, as we used to say. Ron not only has been, and you heard some of the some of the distinction from Eve. Not only is he professor emeritus, which I'm not quite sure what that means, Ron, because you're as busy as ever. So emeritus must be a Yiddish word. I thought it was Latin, but you'll let us know what. But so not only has Ron been a longstanding professor at Pratt, but is the founder of the Pratt Center, former city planning commissioner, and a longtime ally and visionary. And I will say this: I was just talking to Ron earlier about this, and I was telling him I hope he sees his fingerprints in the progressive shift that we've seen in the city, state, and country. I mean, Ron. We will get a taste of some of Ron's vision in the inevitable stock transfer tax mention that he'll make at some point. But there's so much of what we are both accomplishing and on the verge of accomplishing as environmental justice, as community development professionals, that Ron has been talking about literally for decades. It reminds me of that old saying, that we are limited not by our abilities, but by our vision. And Ron is limitless. So with that said, Ron, take it away, friend.
Well, thank you. After that introduction, I'm afraid to say anything. But we're meeting tonight at a very unique time. Many of us are really pleased by the fact that there is now an avalanche of news coming out of Washington, D.C., that while some of us may feel it's not going far enough, it is at least based on principles and ideas that have come from the bottom up and from the communities that we're all concerned about and we're all working with. And we meet tonight at this unique point in time. The issue of housing, ranging from issues of supply, affordability, quality, cost, availability, and access, is front page news now. And every day there's a new event. Today I couldn't even keep up with the new budget amendment put forth by our president. It is in this context that the right to housing must now be understood and is part of an integral and universal struggle that we still are engaged in for dignity and justice and from freedom from want. Too often we talk about the right to housing merely as a commitment to build more, to a housing production program. While production and preservation of housing is critically important, we too often ignore the adverse systemic impacts of racial and social and economic and cultural and environmental discrimination on our housing and development policies. The right to adequate and affordable housing has got to be a product of the intersection of economic, social, and environmental justice, and should be conceived of as a common good, universally accessible, and not as a commodity accessible only to a privileged few. It began, in 1949, our Congress declared that the general welfare and security of the nation and the health and living standards of its people require housing production and related community development sufficient to remedy the serious housing shortage at that time. That shortage continues, and the realization, it said at that time, was as soon as feasible, the goal of a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American. We're still far short of that. The commitment to a housing as a right was then articulated, actually a year before that, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then again in 1966 by the United Nations International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These documents recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself or herself and his or her family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. In our country, these goals have never been met. If anything, they've been misused to pursue, at times, discriminatory ends or ignored totally. All three of these declarations now need to be redefined and updated to meet the needs of today and the challenges of tomorrow. The interrelated impacts of climate change and racism have forced millions to be uprooted, while countless other lives are lost and many more are threatened by processes of gentrification, homelessness, poverty, inadequate housing, and in some cases, the looming climate crisis. These increasingly growing violations of human rights, in particular, the right to housing, as well as other rights such as the right to health, privacy, education, water, sanitation, are rarely addressed. The unfortunate reality is that climate change will force increasing numbers of people to be displaced, to move, and forced to move due to climate change issues. Given that grim reality, our responsibility in 2021 is to guarantee future generations of their right to housing and to make sure that their rights can be met without dramatic disruptions. If we are barely able to meet the right to housing today, how will we be able to address that right in the future, given the anticipated and dramatic increases in the number of people being displaced due to climate change itself? How will we be able to assure our children and their children their right to housing and the ability to live lives where dignity and justice, coupled with the enhancement of one's ability to satisfy their basic needs, exists? Addressing these challenges is something we must do today and cannot defer to the future, for any delay will be costly and doomed to failure. Failure, in turn, will be costly in terms of lives lost and in the uncontrollable disruptions that will inevitably ripple throughout our city, country, and our planet. This year, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address this issue and an opportunity we cannot afford to squander. I really struggle with these words because what I mean by a once in a generation is it's very easy to talk about administrative change, but we're seeing a change in administration on a local, city, state, and federal level. And I think all of those changes, from our council members to the members in Congress and in the presidency, and the administration changes they bring about, coinciding in between 2020 and 2022 is a moment we cannot afford to lose. And so tonight we're going to discuss the issue on how we can seize the moment. And we have three outstanding activists to make that, animate that discussion. In your chats, you can download, I think, the bios of all of the speakers that are coming on tonight and will be discussing this issue. And I really look forward to hearing their discussion and bringing out the issues in a much more articulate and comprehensive way than I can. But I'm going to touch very briefly on them, and then I'm going to show you a brief trailer to a film that will be made available to anybody who registers for this seminar at a reduced cost, and in some cases, for those who can't afford it, for free. Rob Robinson, one of our speakers, the first in the lineup, who I'll call on in a minute, is a formerly homeless community organizer and an activist based in New York City. His work focuses on changing people's fundamental relationship to land and housing. He works with social movements around the world. He's a longtime member of the U.S. Human Rights Network. His work is framed in international human rights law. In the U.S., he works with communities on several social issues, including poverty and debt, police violence against the poor, gentrification, and access to broadband. He's a regular guest lecturer at the New School, at the City University, and now hopefully at Pratt. Leilani Farha is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing and global director of an entity she founded called The Shift. Her work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good and not a commodity. Leilani has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including through her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, right spaced housing strategies, and one can go on and on. She's also a central character in the documentary Push, which you'll see the trailer of in a moment. And it's a new documentary from an award-winning director, Frederick Gertten, that investigates why we can't afford to live in our own cities anymore. And batting cleanup will be Bariko X. Williams, who is the executive director of something we endearingly call ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development in New York. Which is a leading not-for-profit focused on creating housing and economic justice for all New Yorkers. She formerly was Assistant Secretary for Housing for the state of New York, and has worked with NYU's Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. She's won some awards recently for her understanding of systemic racism's intersections with place and community. I must say that having been around at the founding of ANHD, what ANHD has grown into over the 3 decades or more that it's been around has been simply amazing. And under Barika's leadership, it's gone to a new level that would make its original founders proud. So having said all of that, let's go and just see for about a minute and a half what will be the trailer to the documentary Push.
You know, the first sign that you're gonna have to leave your neighborhood is when vintage clothing shops show up. Then the housing value's gonna go up and then they're all gonna get the push.
In the Greater Toronto area of the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%.
Then we start asking, who's gonna live in cities? Who are cities for?
They want to raise the rent up to like $900 each. If it goes to $34,000, then I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
I've seen the whole area change. They start buying up properties because it's a fantastic investment for them.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is if only. It's much deeper than that.
Owning the house is only a means to making money.
New owners have taken over. We haven't met them, we haven't seen them, we don't know anything about them. It could be Frosty the Snowman for all I know.
I heard one of the councillors said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
I can stand in the middle of the street and no traffic coming.
Paradisi fiscali sono il luogo dove capitalismo e legale si incontrano.
Gold is not a human right. Housing is. We need to reclaim the fundamental right to housing.
Well, I thought the way to begin the discussion on how to reclaim the fundamental right to housing would be by starting with someone who's really experienced it from the street on up. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you to really kick off this discussion. And then I'll also ask you to introduce Leilani at the end of your talk, okay?
Certainly. Thank you, Ron, and thank you to everybody at Pratt for inviting me. It's great to be in a space with you all. Some of you I know very well, and I'm pretty sure I know a lot of the folks out in the audience, although I haven't scanned through the names. But it's truly an honor for me to share, and I believe it's important. It's a part of education to share real live lived experiences, right? Because there's the theoretical, but there's also what people actually live through. And they coincide with one another at several points. And that's something I found out through my own lived experiences. So I'll just share with you briefly. My bio was part of the package. Many of you who know me know I'm formerly homeless, and I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter. And for that part of my life, I call it a transformation. I was transformed by that experience. And by that, I mean, I believed in the American dream. I was raised by parents who believed in the American dream and all of the narratives that go along with it. And then suddenly, after working for a Fortune 500 company for 13 years, I found myself without a job, without a home. And then I sort of started shifting my thinking. And I'm going to ask you to take note of that phrase, make the shift, because it's going to be significant as you hear conversation this evening. I won't delve into it now, but just park that thought somewhere, make the shift. And so, as I laid on the streets of Miami and spent 10 months in this New York City homeless shelter, I kept hearing this term gentrification. And I started wondering what was happening to me, what was happening to people around me. Why are people living on the streets in the wealthiest country in the world? And as I'm laying under the I-395 bridge in Miami, there are these luxury towers going up that would say, where's studios for sale, starting at $795,000, right? And 2 bedrooms starting at $1.5 million. And I'm like, okay, where do people get this money? Nobody has that kind of money. And, over the 2.5 years that I was there, the bunting on those buildings started to change. And all of a sudden I saw for sale or lease, sign a 1 year's lease and get 2 months free rent. The same studios that were selling for $795,000 were suddenly for rent, and they were offering you 2 months free rent if you signed a 1 year's lease. So something is happening. And again, I'm hearing this term gentrification. So a lot of my time spent on the streets in Miami. I would spend days in the library understanding this thing called gentrification. And likewise, when I found my way back to New York City, and I spent a lot of time while I was in a place called the Open Door behind Port Authority, which was a drop-in center that had morphed into a shelter. I'd spend much of my time at the library on 40th Street, understanding gentrification. And it was in 2007 at a conference at Columbia University that I got a wonderful opportunity to articulate what that meant to me and to present a theory to the audience. And I always like to set the stage because I believe there were important people in the room. Eddie asked in the beginning what a professor emeritus is. I know that professors held in high esteem, Eddie, because at that conference at Columbia University, to my immediate right was Dr. Peter Marcuse, professor emeritus from Columbia University, an urban planner, a lawyer. To his right was a woman by the name of Brenda Stokely, known to many of us in New York as a fierce union organizer with DC 37, the Municipal Workers Union, and one of the founders of the Million Workers March movement. And to her right was a gentleman by the name of Ed Ott, who at the time was the director of the Central Labor Council in New York. So 3 very powerful people. I'm just this new member of Picture the Homeless, a grassroots organization in New York, that I was asked to speak on this panel. I'm nervous, I'm soaking wet, my underarms are filled with perspiration. And I said what I had to say, and I made this statement. That statement was gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. The experience that I had and what I saw others going through seemed like there was a predetermined path for some people. And there was a gentleman in that audience who stood up, and when I made that statement, asked me to repeat it. That gentleman's name was Neil Smith. He was a distinguished professor of geography and anthropology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And I would argue that Neil was someone who forever changed my life because he brought me into the grad center and said, you're going to lecture my students. And I said to him, I can't lecture PhD students. I only have an undergraduate degree. And he looked at me very sternly and said, you taught me, you're going to teach my students. And it was that legacy that set me off, that made me try to understand what is happening to people. What does the right to housing mean? And then it was in 2009, as a member of Picture the Homeless, that I was asked by Brenda Stokely to connect with some people who were working on a report in New Orleans on forced evictions. And I'll also ask you to park that thought because it'll come up later. That was organized with my director from this organization, which is now called Partners for Dignity and Rights. At the time, it was called NESRI. Kathy Albisa was a CUNY law professor who had me speak in her classes, but she also wanted my help in connecting with the Right to the City Alliance, which was also in New Orleans at the time. It didn't go well. I ended up coming and supporting the human right to housing at Nesri and Kathy and some other work. And we started working on public housing and the right to housing based on what we saw happen in New Orleans. So you go through a series of transformations and different changes in your life. I got the opportunity to travel to Miami, Florida in 2009 to learn from a group called Take Back the Land, which was operating in Miami under the theory that if our tax money was used to bail out banks and the banks are forcefully evicting us from our homes and foreclosing on us in record numbers, it's not right. And it's particularly happening to people of color. So the same dynamics that you saw in homelessness was happening to people of color, mostly women, and we needed to find a way to fight back. Got very much immersed in that work of Take Back the Land. Folks around the world started noticing that work, particularly in Brazil. And a Brazilian organization by the name of MABI, the Movement of People Affected by Dams in Brazil, reached out to Why Hunger in New York and asked a question of Saulo Araujo, who was an organizer with Why Hunger, and said, do you know this guy? He's always talking about changing the relationship to land, the fundamental. This is a guy we want to talk to. And Saulo laughed. I had a long relationship with Why Hunger through my days at Picture the Homeless, and Saulo puts me on a Skype meeting with them. And they invite me to an encuentro in Brazil, and I've been to Brazil every year since then. I even got there before the pandemic. I was there in January because I was there for the commemoration of a huge dam that broke and killed 272 people. And just before the pandemic, January 2020, I was down there. But what I learned from Brazil was that Brazil has a constitution that says land has to serve a social purpose. It has to serve a social good. And it made me think about our own constitution, which was written in 400 years of good old boy language. And it's problematic, right? It doesn't have those protections in it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's easy to realize those protections, but when it's written in a constitution like that, you have an argument. You have a valid argument, and you have a way to present that argument and a place to present that argument. At the same time, there's work happening in South Africa where there was a rebellion by a group called Abashali, the Shack Dwellers movement. And they're also reaching out to take back the land because they saw Black folks in the US actually taking back vacant houses, breaking in them, moving families in there, and using international human rights law to defend their rights to be in there. Abashali reached out to us. We built a relationship with them. Lo and behold, Abashali also was based on the South African Constitution, which also has the human right to housing as a protection in that constitution, but it was a constitution written in 1996, fairly new constitution. So more and more you start to see that our constitution here in the US is problematic, and it's going to be a change. At the same time, I'm having a connection with all of these different folks, law schools and folks who are coming to me and saying, you are articulating an issue that we've never heard an organizer and an activist talk about. And I said, I was blessed to be surrounded by people who imparted me with wisdom, presented me the written knowledge, started putting books in front of me and asking me to read and interpret what I read. And if I didn't understand it, come back and let's have a conversation. So all that transformation was a process. Joined the US Human Rights Network. There again, it's a collaboration of grassroots organizations, individuals from all across the country who believe in international human rights law and international human rights mechanism and use those to make fundamental social change. As a part of that group, I got to go to Geneva in 2010 for the US's initial appearance before the Universal Periodic Review. And again, for an organizer like me or a community activist who's formerly homeless, to be surrounded with knowledgeable people who will put you in a room with representatives from different countries, and you're basically told, this is the delegate from Mumbai, this is the delegate from Iran, this is the delegate from India. Tell him about homelessness, tell her about homelessness in the US. It was very empowering, and it offered an opportunity that I had never expected, right? It wasn't folks in there coaching me. It was folks who said, you have the knowledge. We want you to go in that room and share that knowledge with the folks in that room because they don't have the knowledge. Impart your wisdom on those folks. So it's been an incredible journey. And a big part of that journey, I asked you to to park a thought earlier on called Make the Shift, but I also talked about a gathering in New Orleans. And that gathering, when I was asked to try to connect a right to the city coalition or alliance here in the US, of which Picture the Homeless was a member, with that group that was working in New Orleans. That group was Tiffany Gardner, who was the Human Right to Housing Director here at Nesri. It was Kathy Albiza, who I explained was the ED here. It was a young lady by the name of Leticia Osorio, a well-known organizer, lawyer, urban planner from around the world, and one Leilani Farha, who hadn't been the rapporteur at that time. But, you know, I was trying to support their efforts. Lo and behold, it didn't work. UN Habitat saw the report as too radical. I believe they never released it, but Leilani will correct me if I'm wrong later on. But it was the start of a relationship that I treasure to this day, that I find very special. So I'm going to just segue right into introducing Leilani, because many of you have heard enough of me, and I'd like to introduce a powerful mentor and a person in my life that has meant a lot. So I'll start out with, she was a founding member of ESCRNet, which is the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Network, of which I'm a longtime member. It was through that formation that many of us around the world as organizers and activists were asked to start to think about who we wanted to be the next rapporteur following Raquel Rolnick from Brazil. And one of the names that was constantly circulated in our group and amongst others was one Leilani Farha. Eventually, Leilani was appointed UN Special Rapporteur in May 2014. And one of the first times I got to work with her closely was in Detroit in 2014, when I was there in June, and Michigan Welfare Rights had asked me for their support in helping to get the UN to come visit and look at the shutoffs that were happening in Detroit and Flint, because people couldn't pay for water, knowing that water is a human right. Well, we wrote to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva. We got a positive response. And at the same time, I went behind the scenes and I reached out to my friend Leilani and said, it'd be great if you could come, because there's housing issues attached to this water issue. And lo and behold, a very powerful visit by two rapporteurs who used mostly their own resources. This was not an official mission of the UN, but they understood the problem and came with their own resources to visit the people in Detroit. And this week I had a conversation with folks in Detroit, and all they do is remember that visit. Maybe they're on the phone tonight. I'm hoping they are. I've put a lot of asks on Leilani over the years, and she's always stepped up. She joined a U.S. Human Rights Network member meeting in Philadelphia in 2016. I was part of a group called International Alliance of Inhabitants in Ecuador in 2016 at the World Urban Forum, but many of us wanted to boycott that forum because we had an alternative urban forum, because we didn't believe it was strong enough what UN Habitat was doing, and we didn't believe in a lot of the language in the Sustainable Development Goals. But there was somebody doing a side event by the name of Leilani Farha, and we all said we had to make sure we supported her. So even though we promised not to go in that forum, we all went in to support Leilani for all she has done for us. 2018, she was in New York for the High Level Political Forum, a week that I will never forget, that culminated in a Sunday night meeting with high-level mayors from around the world, Ada Colau and a bunch of other folks that came in to talk about a municipalist mandate, which was dynamite. During that same week, this UN representative was up in the Bronx in Brook Park. Those of you who know the Bronx, she was in Brook Park. And when I said that's the UN rapporteur, people looked at me, they scratched their head. And we had all these international activists from all over the world up in Brook Park on a Saturday afternoon. That was just a dynamite experience for everybody involved. I could go on and on. There was the visit to the Bay Area and LA to visit all my comrades from RAP, the Western Regional Advocacy Project. She visited Skid Row, she visited San Francisco, and came out with a report talking about informal settlements. Our government has always been in denial about informal settlements. When people are living on the street in tents, on mats, those are informal settlements. Hello, US government, you have an issue. She released a report and a letter to Blackstone Equities in 2019 that is still a powerful organizing tool for all of us, challenging the financialization of housing. She also got with the Working Group on Corporate Accountability to send a strongly worded letter to the US government. And her mandate ended in April 2020. And it was supposed to end with the release of this film Push, of which you saw the trailer and a premiere in New York City. But the pandemic came and interfered with that. But I made a long-term commitment that I would help promote this film because there was a special person in that film and a special person to me. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to that special person, Leilani Farha. Make the shift.
Wow, that is like the best introduction I think I've ever had. Thank you, Rob, so much. I'm really emotional. I really wish I could just see everyone in person. I'm really feeling the COVID, as we call it in my house, the COVID. You know, to embrace you all. And I think what Ron said at the beginning too, we're in a really special and important moment. And to me, it's a moment when we should be gathering and strategizing together in rooms, in parks, wherever. So, and I'm emotional because Rob and I go back so far, and he forces me to think through all of this crazy work we've done over the years. And really, to truth be told, I think I've learned far more from Rob than he has from me. Nevertheless, it's a lovely friendship and collegial working relationship that I value tremendously. So I'm super happy to be here with all of you, and a big shout out to you, Rob, of course. So can someone just tell me how long, 10 minutes kind of thing? Is that what you want me to do? I looked at my notes and I realized I didn't actually write down how long you want me to talk for.
10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
Bob took a little bit longer, but that's okay.
No, I like to be short, and I'm much better in a kind of conversational Q&A kind of thing. What I thought I would do is I wanted to start actually, I should get to my first page of notes. I wanted to start exactly with something Ron said, and that's the importance of the human right to housing now for the future. And of course, if the right to housing had been legislated and implemented by governments around the world, we wouldn't be in quite the mess we're in now, where housing, homelessness, unaffordability, and evictions are concerned. So it's very clear to me, and this is true of the US, but it's true of so many countries around the world. It's very clear to me that we are in a crisis where housing is concerned. And it's very clear to me that it's a human rights crisis, because every housing challenge that we see has an immediate and obvious connection with dignity, security, and to life itself. And if you know anything about human rights, you'll know that that's what they're to protect. That's the whole purpose of human rights. That's the big project of human rights that came about when the world lost its moral compass in World War II. And it was clear that humanity on its own would not necessarily do good. And that maybe we needed some fundamental values and principles, as Ron said, to guide us, that were enacted in law and that governments signed and ratified and committed to. And so if governments had taken any of that seriously and applied that in the area of housing, there is no way we could have allowed homelessness to balloon to more than 500,000 people in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so we wouldn't have allowed people to be scared out of their wits that they're going to lose their home to eviction because the rent is too damn high. We wouldn't have allowed for people to be simply priced out of cities and communities. So we need to reclaim, and it is a reclaiming of the right to housing because it exists. I'm not interested in debates. Does the right to housing exist? It exists. Governments have signed and ratified it, even the government of the United States through, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because housing is a right to life issue. So that's the foundation we need to lay. The other thing I wanted to bring to the table for our conversation is this issue of financialization. You saw a sneak peek of the film, the trailer from Push. I really urge all of you to watch it. Some of you may know about the financialization of housing, and this will just be a fun kind of reacquaintance with it. Some of you may not know the global nature of it, the global patterns, how it operates, and what it's doing to people. And so the film will be an eye-opener for you. And it's just 92 minutes, and what else is there to do in COVID anyway? I'm in lockdown, so really there's nothing for us to do where I'm situated. I must tell you that. We just went into lockdown yesterday. Let me tell you a little bit about financialization. I just want to say a few things about it. The definition that I use, just so you know what the hell I'm talking about, I use the following definition. It's where housing is used as a place to park, grow, hide, and leverage capital. And I really love, I actually love that definition. I came up with that definition myself, I have to admit. So Manuel Albers, who's the main academic who writes in this area, may say, oh, come on, Leilani, that's a little bit whatever. But, you know, I like to make things popular and easy to understand for people. And I love that because, so I'm really frickin' wealthy. So we know, for example, 500 new billionaires were created during the pandemic. Did you know that? 500 new billionaires. One billionaire every 17 hours for the last year has been created in our society. So I'm a new billionaire. What am I going to do with all my money? I'm going to park it somewhere. I'm going to park it in real estate. I want to make money. I'm a millionaire. I want to make more money. I'm going to park it in real estate. I always get a good return on real estate. I want to hide money. Oh, my money comes from illicit arms trade, from the trading of human beings, human trafficking, from drugs. I got to hide that money. Where am I going to put it? Real estate. Oh, I want more money so I can make more money because money makes money. What am I going to do? Park it in real estate and then leverage off that real estate for more money. That's the financialization of housing. I just love that definition. And just so here's a nice little fact, someone can tweet it out. I read somewhere that 80% of all corrupt money, 80% of all corrupt money lands in real estate. And you might think, oh my God, she's probably talking about commercial real estate. I'm not talking about commercial real estate. The total value of residential real estate around the world is now about $220 trillion. And if you don't know what that means, you shouldn't, because no one knows what that means. That's just like a crazy number of zeros. You should like go, 220, what is that? 220 trillion. It is about 3 times the GDP of every country in the world taken together. 3 times. It's a lot. Since 2008, the global financial crisis, when a whole lot of Americans suffered deeply and have actually never recovered, well, a whole lot of people made a whole lot of money. Blackstone is one of them, largest private equity firm in the world. And they made the money by buying up cheap debt in the form of foreclosed mortgages. And they swindled, and the banks were giving away the mortgages. Cheap, 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 like 20 cents on the dollar cheap. And then they made repairs. This is mostly single family homes. They made repairs to those units. I call them IKEA cosmetic repairs. And then they shot the rents up to rental rates that were higher than the mortgages that people were paying who were living there in the first place. Talk about corruption. Then they started moving into multi-units, like apartment buildings. They have these names, you know, multi-family units, as apartment buildings. You saw in that clip an African-American fellow who's talking about his rent having been raised. His name is Derek. You might like to know about Derek. He lived in what used to be called Delano Village in Harlem. And that was a, I think you call it rent stabilized apartments. Yeah, Rob's nodding. Sorry, I don't always know the US terminology, but rent stabilized apartments, there are 1,700 units in that complex. It's an amazing complex, you know, one of those, like, to me, it's like Harlem, New York complex. It's just amazing, red brick buildings. And it was bought by one of these big private equity asset management firms, and his rent was increased to an amount that he couldn't afford. And I just want to show you how sinister all of this is. Okay, so this is Harlem, right? With its history for African Americans. I mean, it's a hugely important place for African Americans. That complex is now called Savoy Park, which is nice, maybe a nod to the Savoy Ballroom, right? Nice. All the units now that you can rent are named after dance styles. You can have the Lindy Hop, or you can have the Charleston, or you can have the Foxtrot. And there are all these distinctive units. That's what they're called. It's a distinctive rental community. Think of how disgusting that is. As they push African Americans out of that building, out of those units, and they co-opt the history, the culture, and they dare to name the units after dance styles that have deep roots in African American culture. I'm sorry, there's no other word but to say disgusting, sinister. That's what financialization does. And they can do it in this clean way because it's just a financial transaction. And the landlord's very far away. It's a shareholder somewhere. A lot of these buildings are turned into basically, they're on the stock market basically. So it's a shareholder somewhere that actually owns that Foxtrot unit or the Lindy Hop unit. Okay, I'm just going to say one more thing about financialization. I know I'm at my 11-minute mark now. So that is one form of financialization. And this is happening around the world. It's not unique to the United States. We're seeing in Berlin, in Spain, in Barcelona, in every city in Western Europe and now Eastern Europe. These private equity firms moving in, what they do is they can't always get cheap debt, but they can get buildings that are considered undervalued. And then they basically just extract or squeeze profits out of the building. They do cosmetic repairs, they inflate rents, they go around legislation, and they push people out and bring in a whole new class of people. But financialization doesn't start and stop there. Think of all the ways financialization of housing and residential real estate has infiltrated society. Think about Airbnb. I mean, I know in New York, it's been a huge problem, now regulated, but it has been a huge problem. Airbnb has been actually marketed as a way to make a good return on an investment in property. And I mean, in the Tube in London, I've seen signs where it's like literally advertised that way: invest in Airbnb. It's not about rent a room in your home. It's buy a second, third, 10th, 100th unit, buy a whole frickin' building and turn it into Airbnb units. That eats up affordable housing stock, but that's a way of financializing real estate or housing or home, as we call it. Think of, I don't know if you're familiar, your country has one, golden visa programs, where, and this is very popular in Southern Europe as a way for cash to flow into the country. It's all corrupt money too. It's invest in this in our country, buy some property for 500,000 euros, and we'll give you residency and eventually EU, an EU passport, so you can go around the EU and travel freely. Think about the way student housing has morphed and changed over time. It's become its own asset class. I'm going to end here by saying, I think as we move forward and we start plotting and planning and strategizing together, how are we going to get the right to housing implemented, legislated in the United States? I think we have to really take seriously this nexus between housing and homelessness, forced evictions, and evictions, unaffordability, that whole area that we're very familiar with as housing advocates. The nexus between that and high finance. Thanks.
Ron, do you want me to go? Oh, wait, Ron, I think you're muted. There.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks a lot.
He's not used to that.
I want to pass the baton over to Barika, but before she does, I want to reiterate something I said earlier. ANHD has played a critical role in New York City ever since New York City was facing its abandonment crisis in the early 70s. And it grew out of the work of some people who were very much committed to taking over vacant and abandoned buildings. It was, in many ways, a lot of what we talk about in terms of what should be done. Land should be controlled and should be developed by the people who live there. And ANHD really grew out of some of the first groups in New York City that took over vacant and abandoned city-owned properties, started rehabilitating them, started putting together an association of various different community-based housing developers, and then began to advocate for what they called a housing justice campaign. And over the years have really helped forge the kinds of policies that New York City is now, has claimed as its success. But it really grew out of many of the members of ANHD in the early days. It continues to play that role. And under Barika Williams' leadership over the last few years, it's really reemerged as a major entity linking together the various different components of what true and effective urbanism should be about. So it's with pleasure that I introduce Barika.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to, of course, Eddie, who I've worked with for years now. Did that work? You guys hear me now? Okay, good. So thank you, Ron, for that introduction, and thank you, Eddie, who I have gotten the pleasure of working with for years now, and to Eve and the whole team, and of course to Rob and Leilani. Excited to get into this conversation with them. It may feel like years, but I really appreciate Ron's comments, because I took over as ED at ANHD just 2 months before the pandemic started. So I have pretty much only done this from my little apartment living room, and have staff that I have never known and never gotten to meet in person. So we are just powering through and trying to catch these different crises. So for those who don't know us, everybody just calls us ANHD, which is this mouthful of letters, Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And we were created more than 46 years ago. So we're almost about 50 years old by, as Ron was saying, the early community development and tenants' rights groups in New York City who, much to their credit, saw the need not just to work in their neighborhoods, but work across space and across the city. And so we're New York City focused, but obviously connect with and interact with many different other groups, different parts of the state, different parts of the country. Rob and I are probably on Zoom at least once a month together. And Leilani and I probably just barely missed each other because I had the pleasure of getting to work on and present and got to know Raquel around a presentation around evictions, forced removal, and territory interventions, and did some cross-international work and was down in Sao Paulo. So excited to get to connect with this group of people. And what ANHD does is really about building community power to win affordable housing, sustainability, and thriving equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. Because of who our members are, and we work specifically with nonprofit organizations that work in communities, we mainly focus on and work in our marginalized communities here in New York City. So that's our Black and Brown, our BIPOC and immigrant communities that are so often left behind, shut out, and ignored. And an important part of the way that we approach this work and that we believe, as Ron was saying, dating back to those early campaigns, is an understanding that housing justice is racial justice, is economic justice, that those things are interconnected. They must be talked about together. They can't be broken apart. And Eddie and others have been pushing us to be like, and that's environmental justice, right? So while we're maybe not in a place to tackle a whole other piece, we recognize there's another piece to this that we also have to be talking about as well. So I'm just going to try to dive in, and there's different things that folks said that I'm going to try to weave together. And I think Leilani sort of took us back to fundamental, the history of fundamental rights and human rights. And I would say one of the parts of this that we really have to grapple with and tackle, especially in the US context, is how fundamental this conversation always is. And the struggle for us in a housing and land and physical space conversation of the fundamental role that racism, oppression, forced removal, and theft has played as a part of land from our beginning, right? So that is a core part of this narrative, and something that I often think we really struggle to recognize and reconcile with when we're having this conversation. So the battle over space, the battle over adequate housing, and the battle over land is fundamental to those days when somebody first arrived at our shores and tried to claim it as their own property, right? And so the right to housing, I think, as Leilani is pointing out and Rob is pointing out, even though oftentimes in New York City we're talking about it in specific neighborhoods, it's really this conversation that is global, that is international, that spans rural and urban in a way that we don't always appreciate. Some of our collaborators in Appalachia and in parts of upstate New York are struggling with many of the same problems that maybe manifest in slightly different ways, but fundamentally are about some of the same things. And so I think one of the important sort of ground this in some of the New York City work is an important thing to understand, is that in New York City, the steady state of housing is crisis. It is and has been crisis. So that is our normal. That is just our constant normal for at least 50 years since ANHD has been in existence, and long predates that, as anybody who sort of digs into New York City housing history could attest to. And that is with the understanding that we also have, I would boast, one of the most successful and sustained housing movements that combines both community development and activism and organizing, and understands how those things work together and coordinates across them, right? So we have a very robust housing movement that has been active for decades. And it's only because of them that we're even where we are. So that is why we have things like the first in the country right to counsel pilot project that has already demonstrated numbers and results like a 25% drop in evictions in its first year of being in place, and now is really in conversation about a model that could happen in other cities, other localities, but really also nationwide. It's why we were in a place to expand, Leilani, you were right that it's rent stabilization, but why we were in a place to strengthen our rent regulation structures, and more broadly, our tenant protections for the first time in 2019, after decades of them being eroded and backslided through HSTPA, which is Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which passed in 2019. And that's, again, these are decades long worth of organizing, building momentum to finally getting something through. So we have any number of those various different fights and work and efforts culminating in success. And yet we're still also faced with finding that, for example, right now there are 220,000 tenants that would be on the brink and face eviction if the eviction moratorium in New York City and New York State expires on May 1st when it's scheduled. And that's not new eviction filings. That are people who are already sitting in the pipeline, ready to go, right? So, and so despite all of this work, we still have this massive crisis and I think Leilani and Rob, it's like, how do we form it? Is it pushed out? Is it priced out? Is it on the precipice? Is it, I think we go through cycles of calling it different things sometimes, but we all still are often talking about it and mean it in a very similar way. And in this moment in COVID, it's just magnified that times 10 at least. So ANHD did some early research and analysis in COVID that found that when you map our predominantly POC neighborhoods with our highest COVID rates, with our neighborhoods where we have essential workers, with our neighborhoods where people are highly rent burdened, you basically end up with the same set of areas popping on the map, right? So it's like these areas light up, and then everything else is and also the areas that have what should be framed in the future, if it's not being used already, as like health deserts, where we have increasingly extracted access to health and healthcare from these communities in the name and in the guise of oftentimes development, luxury development, and housing development. And so I think so that's kind of where we are in this moment. And it's a little strange right now, I would say, for anybody in some of these housing conversations in New York City, because this crisis moment has made some strange housing bedfellows. And I want to come back to Leilani's point of profitization and the money interest, because the money interest and the affordability and the right to housing interest are strangely in line for this very, very singular moment in time. And that's because we're interested in protecting people and protecting them in their home and in a roof, and getting people a right to housing, and getting people who are homelessness in a unit and in stable housing opportunity. And we see that as the priority, and other people see the priority to earn more money, to expand their portfolios, to not lose money and not get aid. And so it's this very strange moment in time where you have very large real estate interests and on the ground, like grassroots housing groups who are saying to the state together and who are saying to the federal government together, we want housing as infrastructure. But we have very different reasons. They're like, this is a whole bunch of money that we can access and leverage. And we're like, well, this is a moment that we can then think about reformulating and changing the housing environment and context. And the struggle, I think, especially in New York, especially in comparison to other parts of the country, we are far exacerbated, is that it's very hard for us to make it over the threshold when we don't have them, when we don't have their voice. That it's multi-year campaigns for the housing movement to be able to topple the political power and the money power that real estate holds in New York City and New York State politics. And so on the one hand, it's to our benefit that for once they're on board. On the other hand, we don't actually align. We don't actually fundamentally necessarily believe the same things. And so it's a very cautious, concerning moment of how do we all finesse this, but also stay true to who we are, what we believe, that we believe in the dignity of people and the right to housing, and that people are not commodities that should be exploited. And at some point in time, we're all going to have to part ways, right? And then what happens? And I think a core part of that, and I want to flesh out some of what Leilani talked about around the profitization, right? And you said park, grow, and hide capital, right? I think I got the three correct. And it is now what drives and dictates almost all of New York City's housing market. It is the driver for it. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat that that housing is the new security deposit, but it's not really safety deposit box. It's not really a safety deposit box. I would actually edit that. That's not, we don't quite frame it like that. The high end of New York City's market is really like a luxury art market. It's a Picasso market. It's just an opportunity to purchase and park cash and potentially clean cash, right? And so there is what happens at the top end of the housing market in New York City and what is happening at the bottom end of New York's housing market almost have, in some ways, they clearly have something to do with each other because they have these perverse impacts on each other, but they almost don't, almost should be happening in two entirely different localities, right? It's very hard to think about them together, but yet that is how our housing market happens. And so we are thinking about, and the city is thinking about, and oftentimes this is where we as movement really struggle, is that the city often is focused on, is thinking about, has this very distorted agenda of maintaining the profit and capital interest of that housing environment and of that housing market, because they have become vested that for some reason they need it in order to maintain New York City's housing market, right? That is now that, like, we need more people, we need more luxury units. Oh, there's a population boom, so what must we do? Without really the appreciation that 75% of New Yorkers make less than 100% AMI, which Leilani is like our median. I think it's at least 60% of New Yorkers would qualify for an affordable housing program in New York City. Right, so we're starting with the bulk of New Yorkers already being what we would consider affordable housing recipients. And what does it mean when we're creating what I really see as what we have what we've created in New York is a trickle-down housing environment, where we're investing an absurd amount of money, an absurd amount of capital, of government resources and government policies in maintaining the top, with the expectation that it will flow and in some way, to Rob's point, create housing for people who are sleeping on the street, right? And that is, they are so divergent from each other. And anybody who actually looks at this in totality knows that that's never going to happen. And Leilani, you mentioned visas, right? So for us, that's EB-5 is where we see this, and the undervaluing of property and the opportunity in property in New York City. We particularly talk about as predatory equity, and the practice of predatory equity, which we are poised to see a rapid increase of, because we know from our previous recessions that we see a massive uptick in predatory equity post-recessions. We know that this is what happened after 2008, and yet government hasn't stepped in and said, let's create a new set of tools to protect these units, to protect this housing stock, to protect these tenants, as opposed to allow the rampant business practice of, we're going to kick out everybody who's Ms. Jones, we're going to kick out the Garcia family. This is a business tactic that oftentimes when you go into their documents, you actually see written up as an as why they are advertising this as an attractive portfolio or project to sell to somebody. So I think going to Rob's gentrification as displacement, as, let's see if I can do this right, homelessness, Rob, to criminalization. Did I do it right? I would add one before that, which is profitization to gentrification, to displacement, to homelessness, to criminalization, right? That there's the profit mode is driving this. And I think we emphasize that because part of how we talk about displacement, and this comes from one of ANHD's member orgs, let's see if I can make sure I want to quote them correctly, CASA, which
CASA.
Is that we consider displacement specifically, here we go. Displacement is the forced movement or movement minus power and choice. And we specifically talk about displacement and gentrification as tied to power, and that it doesn't work to reduce these things, blind and absent power and money, because they are very intrinsically rooted in the interest of power and money. So I'm gonna, I guess I probably just leave it there. I know that's kind of a strange middle point, but I wanna dive into the conversation, but just really thinking about what comes next, which is a lot of what we're doing right now as we, as a city, get ready to have to stand up a $2 billion plus rental relief program and get tenants signed up. Think about what it looks like for a first ever unprecedented infrastructure, housing as infrastructure program coming in, and how we think about all of those things as a opportunity and a moment to build our power and our movement and our belief that housing is a right, and not let it be co-opted by the other forces who see it as an opportunity to accumulate more wealth and to accumulate more profit.
Thank you, Barika, for those comments. I want to raise a question that came to mind at the end, towards the end of your presentation, and you can respond, but everybody on the panel could respond as well. You talk about the fact that there is a lot of predatory equity that's taking place, and you point to the last recession. And I think you're absolutely right, and it's something we have to be very alert to this time. But I'm beginning to think that there may be another aspect to what's occurring out of this economic recession that didn't occur before. And it may provide us with an opportunity if we organize ourselves correctly. And that is that we're beginning to see a lot of office buildings in today's New York Times losing worth of about 25% of value. Rents are dropping precipitously. There are a number of hotels, particularly outside of Manhattan, but around a number of residential communities that we may be able to acquire. There's money coming from the federal government for acquisition of hotel units or other kinds of non-residential units and converting them to housing. How do we position the movement now to make sure that we use this moment in a way to increase the inventory of land and places that we might be able to get control of? using some of the infrastructure money rather than allowing just the privatization and the private sector to take advantage of those units and bottom feed and make enormous profits? Are there ways to use it to transfer property to the communities in much the way that in the 70s and 80s we were able to transfer a lot of city-owned property to a lot of the members that now comprise ANHD? Is there an opportunity, if we craft our agenda correctly, that we might be able to seize?
Yes. So there's a couple of different proposals at the state level around hotel conversions to affordable or supportive housing and to commercial conversion to affordable or supportive housing. One of them might be mixed income housing, but I think the hotels is just affordable and supportive. So both of those are already being discussed. They didn't end up in the budget. I think there's some more conversations and that are happening around them, and part of it is just the politics of what could and couldn't get through. And for folks who don't know, New York State just passed its budget, or its state budget, earlier this week. So this is literally did it or did it not make it through, like Tuesday, Wednesday. There's also, there is some money in the bill, in the state budget for this, but it doesn't necessarily green light the conversion process quite yet. I think we still need the parallel legislation to do that. And then HUD Secretary Fudge also had an announcement, I want to say maybe earlier this week, that also included some competitive grants across the country that include hotel and commercial conversions to housing. So some of this is already in the works. I think the question is potentially pairing some of that with also some conversations and legislation that's being looked at for the city and the state here in New York around community ownership and control. So utilizing things like COPA, which is Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, or TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which allows the tenants or community interest to take control of the property. So some of these are already bubbling up, but I will say, I think one thing we do as a housing community need to be attentive to in this is and we're talking about this with the Hotel Trades Union and some other folks, is that in this opportunity to add to our housing portfolio, that we also appreciate what it means for the economic side. And this is where we go to like our housing justice and economic justice, because many of those hotels are also our jobs for our BIPOC people, right? So we need and want this moment and opportunity to expand our housing portfolio and footprint and create more affordable housing, but we also need to do it in a way where we're being thoughtful and responsible and cognizant of what it might mean on the job side of the equation for many of the people that we're going to want to have access to the housing.
Leilani or Robert, do you have any comments to make about that?
I'm just going to throw in quickly. I wrote down 3 points as I heard Barika's response and I heard you ask the question. And I always look at this from the ground up. You know, Miguel Robles Duran at the New School says, I'm a person, he's never seen a person like me as a foot inside of the policy issues and a foot in the community. But my foot in the community tells me we need to educate folks, right? And sometimes people get offended by that. But when you start talking financialization in communities, people will tell you, I don't need to understand that. Well, yes, you do. And I think a lot of our social movements struggle, or our organizations struggle, because they don't fundamentally understand that. So I do think we have to think about that. I think we also have to form stronger alliances. So groups have to join with groups like ANHD to understand some of these issues, but also, and I'll give you the perfect example, when we started getting money to put homeless people from cognitive shelters and off the street into hotels, there were small organizations calling me as this homeless advocate, how can we get the money? Well, you need to understand how that money is drawn down and how it gets into the city. And if you don't understand that pipeline, you'll never get it. You'll just waste a lot of your time struggling. So when I directed people to like the continuum of care, which is going to get that kind of money in New York, they look at me, oh, we don't want to talk to. You have to understand how the system works, right? To be realistic. And then I'm back to what our theory was with Take Back the Land. And everybody's brought this up, change our relationship to land. How can community control land, right? Land trust is the ideal way that we all talk about. I always like to throw this question into the mix because it throws the conversation on the side. If it's such a popular model, how come we don't have more of them? Because they bring some issues, right? So we really need to think through this. And maybe there's a wound in my side that I carry from our movements not going after 85 acres of vacant land owned by the city out in Far Rockaway. Most of our housing movements say, oh, that's too far out there. Who wants it? It's public land. Get it from the cities. Build your model and let's learn from there, right? So we need some creative thinking, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
In a few minutes, we'll address the 85 acres out in the Rockaways, which may not be 85 acres in the future, but
no, it's not. It's not.
But I want to pick up on your point about, the community land trust, because if you asked me a year and a half ago about a community land trust, I'd say, it's a great idea. A number of us were advocating it when the city owned almost, property throughout the entire neighborhoods in the city. And when I was on the city planning commission, I advocated either a land bank and did not want the disposition of any city-owned property. The most I could get at that point in time was an agreement that they had to assess 9 square blocks before they auctioned off any piece of property. But even that was eroded during the Giuliani administration and past that period of time. But I think at this point in time, we may have an opportunity, if we're talking about bailing out some of these buildings with public money, why not use that to get a certain percentage of those public, where that money goes, to make sure that it is publicly owned, and that we're transferring the ownership of the land to communities through either land trusts or to the municipality itself. And I was just wondering, Leilani, I see you shaking your head. Maybe you have a couple of ways of really doing that. And how do we really look at using this as an opportunity to make the land trust model work, to see how it worked with the mutual housing associations, and begin to really and finally get a program that may be more meaningful than it was, or have greater potential than it had 14 months or 15 months ago?
Yeah, so I'm not a land trust expert by any means. I know very little about land trust. What I was nodding both energetically about was I really believe in that this is an opportunity for the creation of public assets. And then, so that being the sort of first step and the first mental mode, more public assets. And then from there, determine, is it going to look like land trust, or what's it going to look like, and perfect the model. But I absolutely, I've been telling cities around the world, you have to, now is the chance. You divested yourselves for years and years and years of public assets, and now you need public housing assets. 1, 2, I wanted to say, one of the things that I've really hated about the pandemic and all the money rolling is this money is rolling, and they're talking about money. We're going to spend on housing, going to address homelessness. And there are no accountability and human rights accountability mechanisms in place. Now, I can't speak for New York. New York, maybe there's some human rights accountability mechanisms in place for how money rolls. But where like in Canada, zero, nothing. And it's really, if as an advocate, it's what I have been calling for in my own country when I have time to advocate here, trying to get my government to set up a human rights accountability oversight body for the monies that are rolling with diverse expertise, because it's not just housing, obviously, there's so many other areas. But I really think That's very key. And there's a way, I mean, we know who these private actors are, and they're assholes, and they will do what they need to do to make money. They're greedy. They have a seat at the political table in a way that we often don't, and they can control so much. So that accountability piece is super important, and I would be agitating for that pretty strongly. The last thing I want to say is about governments trying to increase their assets, public assets. One of the things that worries me is their ability to compete in the market. And so I really agree with right of first refusal legislation. I've seen cities enact right of first refusal legislation. So, so that they can get in there, because literally, I mean, if you read, maybe you already have, all of you, but read Aaron Glance's Homewreckers book about 2008, and the big guys with literally briefcases of money going to sites and purchasing them. I mean, it's mind blowing. And so if governments that are really cash poor often, or they say they are, although now they seem to be printing money, so who knows, but if governments are going to compete, it may be that they need the right of first refusal or some way to elbow out the other guys. I mean, you saw Blackstone already bought a hotel chain, right? That motel chain. And there are some homeless people living in those motels that they bought. And so they're on the prowl already. So yeah, I think that right of first refusal or something like that. I don't know. And I just wanted to say, Barika, I loved all of your comments, and I can't believe that we haven't worked together yet, but I really think I can learn so much from you. So you're on my list of people to have a subsequent phone call with. So nice to meet you.
And Ron, sorry, I'm gonna jump in, but like Lottie, it's so amazing some of the things that you're bringing up. So folks, I'll try to drop it in the chat, but ANHD literally just posted on ROFR, right of first refusal, as a blog post yesterday, because our ROFR protections for our existing low-income tax credit units are being attacked by these very actors and investors. At the end of their tax credit turns, they're supposed to exit, and the property is supposed to go to the nonprofit affordable housing owner and investor. They're supposed to turn over the rights, and they basically gain ownership of the property for a minimal value. And we have some big investors right now, currently Sun America, who are suing nonprofits across the country, trying to keep their market interest, because now they're like, well, actually, I want to keep this building. Oftentimes with the tactic of it's going to take too long, it's going to be too costly, or the nonprofits aren't going to be able to pay for it. So Riseboro, I encourage everybody to, I'll drop the information in. Riseboro is in a protracted, expensive lawsuit right now for a relatively small nonprofit, over 35 units in Bushwick, because we all recognize what this threat means for our 50-year housing industry if we let this happen and move it through, and simultaneously working on some federal legislation to try to protect it. But a perfectly timed comment, but it's good to know that's an international conversation that should be happening.
So just quickly in response to both of you, I do think, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I do think the landscape in New York City is going to change. The traditional office building is going to go away. So what happens to those towers, right? JP Morgan Chase, one of the greedsters in this work, is divesting itself. Bank branches are closing everywhere. They're selling off office space or subleasing office space. So the environment is changing. So there's going to be a lot of vacancy in big office buildings and hotels. Barika touched on a little bit, that monthly phone call that we're on. There's some struggles based on what we call ULURP in the city, trying to convert those buildings. It's going to be some challenges in there. But I think we do have an opportunity like never before, as Leilani said. And then back to the human rights thing, we do have a Human Rights Commission here in New York. I don't think it's staffed as well as it could be, and it has the resources that it needs. I keep advocating and talking about it a lot, but Leilani is creating a model up in Canada where she's bringing municipal governments together for conversations on this stuff. And I was privy to watch one of those or two of those, and we're trying to replicate that model in New York, Pittsburgh, and Atlanta. So Barika, there's the bridge right there. We are going to reach out to some young people that got elected into the office that we know have progressive values to start to force a conversation inside the halls of government. And I think ANHD and you would hold a special place in there. And just to share before we get off this call, I already work closely with one of your staff, Lucy. So.
Great. Oh, that's back. Okay.
I'm reminded by this conversation in the mid 80s, we were Liz Abzug, Bella Abzug's daughter, Bella Abzug's daughter, Liz, was I think state commissioner of human rights, and she contracted with the Pratt Center, and we developed a whole set of proposals around what would be a human rights impact statement that would be comparable to the environmental impact statement. And I think we need something along those lines to deal with any real estate zoning or planning impact that creates change within a particular neighborhood. Because I think it's really essential that we look at the impact on people. And so a lot of this is how we begin to craft, the language around the programs that we want legislated. The rules and regulations governing them are critically important. One of the fights we won in the 70s was the Community Reinvestment Act. Well, the Community Reinvestment Act brought a lot of money into the cities, helped organizations, many of which are members of ANHD, be able to, pull together the financing for the housing they built. But today, that community reinvestment isn't targeted to benefit the people that live in the neighborhood. It's targeted to benefit the geography. So you could use the CRA money today to displace people who are living in a neighborhood and invest in those in predatory lenders, the kinds of, like Blackstone and others that are really coming in and destroying the neighborhood, and they get CRA credit for that when displacement itself should be an issue that disqualifies them. And I think we have to start thinking creatively around program and policy and the rules in which they're implemented.
And Ron, if I can chime in on that, that's a conversation that we have a new opportunity to do, because actually under the Trump administration, the OCC had moved forward some terrible proposals to the Community Reinvestment Act, some to the CRA that we were very, very strongly opposed to, that will get put on hold, and I believe hopefully we'll be moving through a new process and engagement and comment period on some new proposals to modify the CRA. And some of the things that are up for discussion are explicitly the role of geography in the CRA, the need for an understanding of attention to tenants' rights, displacement, and evictions as part of the responsibility of the investment, and the CRA not being race blind, which is a sort of a constant struggle we have of just looking at the place absent the people, and the people having different levels of equity, access, and oppression.
Right. Leilani, there's a question for you. If you could please explain the municipal mandate.
I was just typing in the chat, but I'm happy to verbalize because I'm not typing fast enough. That's from Rob. Rob, do you mean
basically touch on your work and the goals and objectives of what you and Otto were working on? I think that's a thought process that we'd love to introduce here.
Sure. So when we started the shift a few years ago, just the movement itself, not the entity, it came out of an understanding, obviously, that a whole bunch of paradigms needed to be shifted. And what I found as I was thinking it through was that I had such good partners in cities from around the world. such good alliances. Not all cities. Some cities are the biggest abusers of human rights and implementers of forced evictions, for example, and treat home. I mean, look at in the States, some of the cities, how they're treating your people who are living in homelessness, right? So recognizing that, I'm not blind to that, but also recognizing that cities are situated really on the front lines of the housing crisis in so many ways. And so the shift was actually done in partnership with an international network of cities called UCLG, United Cities and Local Government, and they represent about 250,000 cities from around the world. And they're an umbrella organization. And so it was with them, as well as with a body at the UN, that we formed the shift. ADA at the time held the kind of presidency of this network of cities. So ADA being the mayor of Barcelona. And so it was like a kind of serendipity thing. So when we launched, we felt we needed to launch with something. So Ada Colau, who's, comes out of a right to housing movement after the 08 crisis, and is very committed to ensuring people can stay in their homes, was decided that she would write what she called a manifesto. So it was it ended up being a city's declaration that really a whole bunch of cities, now more than 40 cities, have signed on to. The pandemic has kind of intervened and not let that go forward to some degree, because cities are so busy. But 40 cities have signed on. It has multi-parts, but they do all commit to using housing as a human right as a framework. And then from there, all of their housing related and finance related policies should be moving forward the right to housing. We then in Canada took that during the pandemic. Here I am stuck in Canada and thinking, well, I'd like to at least do some advocacy here, seeing I can't travel anywhere. And so the shift started a municipal working group here in Canada that Rob mentioned. And what we did was we just threw it open and we said, look, there's a housing crisis, there's a pandemic. I think you're all struggling. Look to me like cities didn't know what the frick to do. They were scrambling how to house homeless people. We have a lot of homeless people living rough, tripled and quadrupled up in households. So we just threw open. We said, okay, we will facilitate a round table. Let's see who comes. And lo and behold, 14 cities came to the table. They thought what they were coming to the table to discuss was just housing, homelessness. But of course they knew me and I'm chairing. So I guess they knew, but we didn't make it explicit. But what we were going to talk about was human rights. And we've been going now for a year. And it's incredible. I mean, the cities themselves have mobilized, and they've called themselves the Right to Home Municipal Working Group. They have, and here's what I think is interesting for you all. They have created a call to action. So it's a call to action for themselves. We have human rights obligations. We are going to end homelessness. We are not going to allow evictions to lead to homelessness, blah, blah, blah. But then it's also a shout out to the other orders of government. So in your case, it would be states and national level government. In my case, it's provinces and national level government. So the call to action also says, hello, we can't meet our human rights obligations unless you, other orders of government, play ball with us. And so, I mean, this is embryonic, but it's a really interesting kind of intergovernmental thing that's happened, that started really as a city initiative, but super important as this money is flowing, right? Because where is it going to flow? It's going to flow to state and city level. So really important to use cities and their relation with other levels of government to help you ensure human rights accountability. Is that what you wanted me to talk about?
How do we amplify that? How do we make sure that the small activities that we're undertaking in various different neighborhoods reach a level of scale? When we first got started in the 80s, Roberta Gratz wrote about it in The Living City. And by just in her book, The Living City, Thinking Small in a Big Way, what that did is it exposed these ideas or to many others, and it had a multiplying effect that then leveraged the kind of resources and the political momentum that we need. How do we really begin to talk about the work that ANHD is doing, or the work that Rob is doing, or the work of the of Push and the Shift in really amplifying these efforts? So in addition to the film, I mean, the film is really important, and I want to plug it, and I'd like you to give it a plug before we end the conversation. But how do we really get this going across in a much more magnified way so that people are learning and replicating what we're doing? A bunch of silence. Robert?
That's a big question. So I'm going to jump in. So everybody, we all look like deer in headlights. It's a tough question, Ron, but I think you know me a long time. I'm a believer in collaboration. We can't do it alone. I can't do it alone. ANHD can't do it alone. Leilani's one person. This is something I used to stress when I worked closely with Leilani as a rapporteur. And you get different people, you know, oh, Rob, you have a relationship with Leilani. We have this eviction happening over here. You can't work on every eviction. What can Leilani do for us from up here, right? She's one person with a very small staff. I think we have to collaborate. We have to come together. And maybe this conversation started that. Barika said she needed to connect with Leilani. I have a connection with Leilani. I just told Barika I work closely with one of her staff folks. She has some young folks over there with some incredible knowledge. I like to be around the young college students, you know that, Ron. So I think bringing these folks together, right? When I was doing the work of Take Back the Land, we knew we weren't going to be victorious unless we had the policymakers on our side, we had the community on our side, right? You know, I'll be clear to this group. If you're telling somebody you're going to break in houses, you better have legal people, representatives behind you, right? So you form partnerships and you understand that we're doing this for the greater good of the community. So I think it's conversations that have to happen. We're guilty sometimes on the ground of just fighting in a defensive mode and not taking a step back to do the strategic thinking we need to move forward in a way that's going to make social change. So these are a lot of the things I bring. Right to counsel, worked in that way. Barika talked earlier about CASA. I'm doing a training with CASA on Wednesday night. It's, you know, I go back to the director who's with Right to Counsel now, used to be the director at CASA, right? And she's also working with ANHD. You know, Susanna and I go way back. So I think it's collaboration, bringing what you have and putting in the pot so that we could all build this together. I just think it's going to come from collaboration. We have to come out of our silos that we're so used to working in, particularly on this side of the border, right? We love to work in silos. I can't work with Ron and Pratt because I got money from this foundation to do that. We all want the same things. How do we pool our resources and energy together to build a world that we want to see? So that's my thoughts.
Let me raise one question that your reference to the Rockaways and the 85 acres raised in my mind. And this is an issue that I think is coming to the fore. I believe yesterday, Barika, in the great forum that you had, there was a discussion by a member that the city council is now going to look at how we spend infrastructure money in communities that are threatened by climate change. And which to my mind, and Eddie and I discussed this earlier today. By the way, Eddie had to leave because he had a meeting with Senator Schumer and others today on environmental issues, so he left at a few minutes before 7. But Eddie and I were talking earlier, and a lot of the communities that are in areas that are subject to being flooded or adversely impacted by climate change are BIPOC communities or communities of color. And at the same time, if we're going to start talking about evaluating infrastructure investments, we have to make sure that we're not creating what is potentially a new form of redlining of those same communities. And how do we do that using, and Barika, this is a Yiddish term called seichel, common sense when we are applying some of these laws. And to my mind, I think it really is important that we tease out, how do we address this in areas that, like the Rockaways, where you've got thousands of units of public housing that may be 6 feet underwater before the end of the century. And to many, that seems like it's a lifetime away. To me, I remember going to the Rockaways 60 years ago and beginning to look at a proposed urban renewal plan called Auburn, which did more to destroy that neighborhood than to create the neighborhood. So I think we have to start looking forward a little bit, because if it's going to be flooded by 5 to 6 feet, 60 to 70 years from now, by 2100, maybe there'll be a disaster before that. What happens to all the residents that live there? So how do we balance this need to be accountable on infrastructure investment with the need to benefit the people who now live there? So let me ask Barika to answer it, and then Leilani, and then I'll ask.
Leilani, go ahead.
No, I think I took the floor before you, so you go.
I mean, I think this is I think some of this, Ron, is a bit of a $1 million question, and I would say one of the challenges we clearly have, not just in New York City, I would say across the country, and I know that other cities in around the globe are dealing with something similar, is how you articulate and navigate and instill, especially in politicians, the intersectional nature and outcomes and needs of this work when they operate in very short political cycles, right? And this is where we see this come to fruition and come to a head in a problematic way, is if their lens, if all that matters on their lens is 8 years, then they don't care the same way what happens to the project 50 years out. Unless it's built as their legacy, it doesn't, it's moot for them, right? Whereas while we want 300 units of affordable housing, I don't want 300 units of affordable housing that are going to be underwater, where these people are going to be out of a home, where people are going to lose all of their goods, where their life might be at risk in the course of 1 or 2 generations from the minute they step in. That's not a smart investment to any of us. And so I think we and Eddie and Uprose and some other folks have been great people at really driving us all to really have the conversation around climate and not divorce the conversation around climate insecurity from the short term, what feels like long-term goals, but are actually the short-sightedness of housing objectives and benchmarks. Go ahead, Leilani.
Yeah.
Leilani, you raised your hand. So.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you just said. And I have to say, I have this anxiety myself around the climate conversations vis-a-vis that happen without due consideration for the things that we're talking about here, because there's so much talk right now, especially in Europe, for example, but everywhere, about the need to build in a climate, in a green way, in a climate friendly way, for example, or that people are living in. And I apologize, I don't really know about the Rockaways, but people are living in places that are susceptible to being destroyed as a result of climate change related disasters, and very little conversation about the fact that if we engage in like what they call this sort of green wave of renovations, for example, to make buildings greener and more energy efficient, that what will happen is rents will increase, or people will be ousted out of their apartments while the buildings are upgraded to be green, and then they'll lose their homes, and etc. Or when you're trying to protect people against climate-related disasters, you end up displacing people and making people homeless. Like, that conversation is not happening, and it really worries me. It's as if, I don't mean to say that I agree we need to grapple with climate change and do things differently in new ways, et cetera. But when people start saying to me, oh, we can't use cement anymore. You can't use cement anymore because cement is actually one of the worst things, one of the worst building products. And I'm thinking, so developers and builders will say, whoa, I can't build for you affordable units because now you don't want me to use cement. You want me to use this more expensive product. And so, sorry, I'll build, but no affordable units for you. Like, I'm just so terrified that conversation isn't happening. It is something the Shift is going to work on. We're actually going to put out some kind of a 5-page briefing note on these kinds of concerns. But this issue in the States, for example, with racialized communities living in climate insecure zones or whatever you call them, is deeply concerning to me. I mean, I've seen it happen around the world where informal settlements are located in areas that get flooded. And then the government says, oh, the tsunami is coming. We're going to put in a big, huge barrier wall. And sorry, that wall goes right through your community. Right. Anyway, I'm just telling you my anxieties at 7:20 p.m. on a Friday night.
Your anxieties are very well placed. And I think that those are the issues that we have to engage in. On one level, there are communities that were put in places that are very, very vulnerable. In some cases, and I visited a number of them, where there are squatter villages and other places like that, where you can, by proper infrastructure, correct the inequities that are there. There are other places where we can't control nature, where a 6-foot surge can wipe that community out in no time. And so one has to be able to differentiate between the two and be able to plan those in equitable ways. I would also argue that one way of maintaining, making sure that the cost of maintaining and operating housing does not escalate, is by really turning them green. At the same time, if we do that in a way that forces them to be displaced, it becomes a tool. It's almost like a Trojan horse that you're bringing in for displacement. It's the same thing with any public policy that we engage in. We have to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that it's benefiting the people that we're working with. And we just can't, in a way, just accept anything without continuing to monitor it and evaluate it.
Yeah, and on that, Ron, I see Bruce and David in the chat about around relocating Leilani. They're specifically talking about it in the Rockaways, but really just any vulnerable, extremely climate vulnerable area. And I feel something very similar to you, where I get very nervous when I hear these conversations, and it's not because I don't fully recognize the threat. I don't fully see the need to address it. But like, let's be real about where we are, folks. We are still in a global health and economic pandemic, and could not summon the capital, the political will, and the follow through to relocate homeless individuals to vacant units in that exact moment in time. So if we can't do that, like the expectation that we would do this in a way that it centers impacted people, centers their dignity, their integrity, their community, their protection, and their safety, it raises some real flags and some real concerns. That doesn't mean that we don't have to have the conversation, but I think we have to really recognize where we are and what evidence and history has shown we tend to do, which is maybe start doing it and then backslide. Oh no, we're not going to keep everybody on the Upper West Side. We're going to acquiesce to political pressure and change, right?
So Ron, if I could just real quick, Marika makes some great points, but I do think the conversations have to happen, Barika. I don't think they're happening, right? And this is my frustration with groups on the ground. And I'm not putting this on any of you, but I'm in communities. And I always ask the organizer, where do these conversations happen? I'm lucky enough to filter through academic circles, through policy circles, and I run through all of these. So I'm in part of these conversations. But I just challenge us to figure out how we get groups on the ground engaged in these conversations, because it has to happen now. But you laid it out so clear. We didn't have the will during a pandemic to effing house the homeless folks on the street, right? Like, so when is stuff going to change?
Yeah, my feeling is that to a great extent, we've learned a tremendous lesson from COVID and the pandemic. It is, to my mind, just the tip of the iceberg. Because what happens as those icebergs melt is that we're able to, within a year or year and a half, maybe even longer because of early research money, be able to come up with a vaccine to deal with COVID. We're not going to be able to come up with a vaccine to deal with sea level rise, very high temperatures that are going to displace millions and millions of people around the world. So we're going to see, and we're going to have to adapt and hopefully open up our arms to people wanting to cross the borders and coming into the United States. We're also going to see a lot of movement of people in the United States from one place to the other. And we have to think about it, because if we don't think about it now, how are you going to replace a few thousand units of low-income housing that could be wiped out in another Superstorm Sandy in some vulnerable places like parts of the Rockaways and in a couple of other parts of the United States? There are other places we can protect. There are some places where they've been talking about spending anywhere between $30 to $100 billion to build a wall to protect part of New York City's harbor. What if we took that 30 billion or a small amount and invested in people? Abolish poverty. I hate to sound like an idealist, but we can abolish poverty. What if we did it to provide income for people in public housing? So we think about how to reduce their vulnerability over time. And I think, as Robert points out, this is a discussion we have to begin today. We can't do it the day after the storm, because the people will be on the streets. We have to think about what we do in those cases. We have to do it in a way that addresses every one of Leilani's fears and your fears, Barika. I think they're really valid. I'm not trying to in any way belittle them, and I know that groups like ANHD and the members of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance are overwhelmed with work. And this is asking people to get engaged in something they're not funded to do. But the reality is we have to force the donors to make that available. So we're beginning to discuss it now, so we don't have to talk about the tragic events that are going to take place. The other thing we know with climate change is that it's not only going to bring heat and hot water, it's going to bring more what are called vector-borne diseases. What we've seen with COVID, we have to absorb those lessons and absorb them in a way that translates into the kinds of public policies that we adopt. And I would hope that the voices that are represented around the table here today really engage in that discussion, because if we don't, I think we're going to have one major episode after another. And so let me just ask, it's 7:30, let's go through each of our panelists and just ask, starting with whoever wants to go first, just what your thoughts are and want to leave with the audience that we have here.
So I'm going to jump in here, Ron. You made the point that we found a vaccine in a year, right? It threatened the world. It didn't threaten a specific group of people, right? So where's the political will to address the poverty, to address structural racism and all the problems that were created from the time this country was created? Where is that will? Where's the energy put into that? When a pandemic threatens the world, there's a reaction, right? Everybody jumps in. I think we really have to think about political will with this issue, who we have in office making decisions. We have a representative democracy, or do we have the right representatives there, right? That's a big part of this equation, right? We have to get the right people into those offices so that the political will shifts, that they want to address these issues. So that's kind of where I am right now.
But you don't think that thousands of people at the border, you don't think that that will lead to, a confrontation between the mass of people and those who on the top benefit?
Listen, I'm sympathetic to that cause. A lot of my work is outside of the country.
Not questioning that.
Yeah, it's about the people making decisions for us, right? That's a huge part of it, right? We see political divisions and polarization. We just went through 4 years that we're still trying to scratch our head and claw our way out of, right? That was just challenging. I think there's a lot for us to think about. I think some issues were brought to the front here, but I still say conversations need to happen within communities, and the urgency needs to be reiterated amongst our folks. And, I do think this is the start of a good conversation, right? We started locally, the conversation circled the globe, right? So we're not in it alone, right? It's happening everywhere. So again, I'm a big believer in bringing folks together. This is why I work in the international community. Evictions are not isolated here, right? If you get on some of those international calls that Leilani and I on, evictions are happening all over the world, right? But, sometimes we live in a vacuum here, and I would just put a little thing over that vacuum and say, U.S. exceptionalism needs to go away, needs to dissipate.
I think this is a longer discussion and we should have it. Marika, do you want to wrap up?
Yes, I'm trying to think. So I think where I would focus is on the need and investment in organizing and movement building. And I think especially in the US right now, we see what we can do. We see what we can harness and leverage when we put people power to pushing political power. So my family's from Georgia and very proud of what happens there.
Tell it.
Able to do, and I'm talking about people who have never been poll workers in their life, who were signed up and dragging people out of their homes to make sure that they were getting to where they needed to get to. But I think at some point in time, we created this context of like, there's a good kind of activist and everybody else are creating problems. And while it feels sometimes a little messy, especially for folks in the policy space or designers or architects, the truth is that movement is creating the space for us to do the work that needs to happen. We don't get to step into anything unless they create that space for us to step into with them. And so we need to be a part of that. We need to invest in that. We need to be telling funders and government and everybody else that they have to make space for that. And so this is not normally what I would say, but I would say in this moment in time in the US, especially, the focus and the priority right now, which is not what ANHD does. So, I'll just say that right off the bat, has got to be thinking about all these confrontations about against voting rights, because that fundamentally changes so much of what we can and can't do. And better believe what they're doing in other places is gonna come home to our front door. It's not as if it's not being discussed in some of our more conservative upstate communities and downstate communities. We already see some of this battle happening around the recent cannabis legislation, where they realize that they can opt out of dispensaries, but they can't opt out of allowing use. And people are like, oh no, I want to change it. The rollbacks of bail. So I think that while that's not in the housing space, I think we've got to understand how tied these things are, and really make sure that we are being siblings, brothers, sisters, non-gendered relatives in this movement to make sure that we do not recede, because housing in New York City is trying to still get out of the receding of rights that we had 40 years ago. We don't want to repeat those mistakes.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to quote somebody from your panel yesterday, Julian Brave Noiscat, who basically said the nerds have to become organizers. And in many ways, that's exactly what I think some of us are leaning towards. Leilani, we'll give you the last word as a panelist, and then we have an announcement or two to make. So Leilani.
All right. I have to say I have to run shortly because it is the first day of a belated spring break for my children, and I promised I would eat dinner with them, and it's ready. So I will leave with this. I actually think you have in the Biden administration something quite interesting. Whoever got him to say it, he said it. Housing is a right, not a privilege. I think you need to capitalize on that and push to give some teeth to that. And to me, that means you need the human right to housing in legislation. And I don't know what that looks like. I would love to work on that. That would be like so much fun. And then with that, I will say also one thing. They always say location, in the real estate business, location, location, location. I say accountability, accountability, accountability. I think, Rob suggested mobilization, you need to start mobilizing, stop working in silos, et cetera. And I think once that happens, I think that what should be demanded is accountability at every level of government, and using human rights values and principles as the measure, period. Whether we're talking climate change, whether we're talking how to regulate or whether to regulate Airbnb, whether we're talking about the purchase of distressed assets, all of it has to be done through an accountability framework, a human rights accountability framework. I leave it there.
I want to thank Leilani, Barika, and Robert for a really exciting conversation. So thank you one and all. But before anybody leaves, I want to announce that on April 30th, we'll be having the fourth and final part of this series on the decolonization of the planning and development professions. And I'd like to invite everybody to come to that. Jared, are you on? Can you
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. I want to introduce my colleague, Jared Delane, who has been doing some outstanding organizing at Pratt around certain ideas. And he's put together something that I'd like him to announce. So Jared, it's all yours.
Greetings, everybody. I've been blessed to be connected to the legend Ron Schiffman, working on a number of housing initiatives. We have a symposium coming up where we're going to bring some thought leaders together to talk about this problem that's around all of us, which is most cities in America are segregated, and that didn't happen by accident. That there were initiatives, rules, restrictions, zoning laws that were put in place that have set cities in the trajectory that they are. And we love to come together to talk with some thought leaders about how do we solve this problem and come with some solutions. So really look forward to it. It's going to be an exciting conversation, and I hope to see you all there.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you one and all. Thank Amron, thank Delaney, thank Eve, thank Eddie. And I want to thank again the speakers tonight for what was really an exciting conversation. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you on the 23rd and on the 30th again. Take care.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye.
And enjoy your dinner later.
Jared, that sounds great. Looking forward to that event.